Hey, what's up, everybody? Chris here. I'm the CEO of a startup company focused on ensuring there's a sustainable supply of human plasma and other components necessary to treat and cure the rare and chronic diseases that rely on plasma-derived therapies. I'm also the host of this podcast. Did you know there are more than 1 million plasma donors and more than 100,000 dedicated staff and professionals supporting this industry? But no one is having real conversations focused on the issues that exist within the current system. We sit down with people from all walks of life to have real conversations about all things plasma so that we can all learn the human side of this incredible business. Well, hello to our listeners. Thanks for tuning back in. Last week, we had a fascinating chat with Peter Jaworski about the ethics of compensating donors for plasma donation. And so we touched on some of the regulatory aspects last week, but this week we're going to dive in deeper into the regulatory landscape. So grab a seat and let's dive right in. So James, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Chris.
James, I'm not sure if you realize this, but we've been working together since before either of us had children, and so
I barely remember.
So it's been a bit.
I barely remember that time frame. Yeah.
I know, huh? So James is a father to a boy and girl, and I think they're 6 and 8, something like that. Yeah. He's a lifelong learner, originally from England. He earned his PhD in microbiology from London South Bank University in 2002. James is a regulatory expert with more than 17 years of experience in the plasma-derived therapy space, including experience in chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. He has extensive experience related to the collection and manufacturing of plasma-derived therapies, including both CBER and CDER arms of the FDA. And the European Medicines Agency, the MHRA, which is the UK equivalent of the FDA, roughly, the Plasma Protein Therapeutics Association, Health Canada, and Chinese authorities. His most recent role was a senior leadership in global regulatory affairs for one of the top plasma-derived therapy producers. And so, James, welcome. Thanks again for coming on.
No, it's nice to connect with you again, Chris. Thank you. It was really nice of you to ask me to participate in this conversation, since a lot of the topics we're going to talk about have been very relevant to my roles in the last few years. So yeah, I hope for a good chat.
Yeah. So first question for you is like, what was your journey in moving to the United States?
50,000 foot version. When I was just finishing up my PhD, my professor was writing an academic book, and she had a partnership with a professor in University of California out here, and he basically provided her with an academic chapter and said, if you got any PhD students who want to come and work in California for 3 years, like do a postdoc. So at the time, I was kind of looking around what to do, and my professor asked me. So I came out here. I think it was pretty much 21 years to the day. It was kind of late August. I came out for a week and met with the professor here in California, and he offered me this kind of 3-year gig postdoc. And, that turned into 20 years later. I'm still here. I was expected to be here for 3 years, enjoy get my pasty white skin adjusted to California sunshine and go home again. But no, 20 years later, and big part of that is probably 17 years ago is when I was introduced to the plasma-derived medicine industry, and been there ever since, really, in different capacities.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so we're going to jump in today to the regulatory framework in the United States regarding plasma collection. Just a brief overview, and then James can provide the details in here. But throughout the 1980s, the Food and Drug Administration ramped up its oversight of the plasma collection as it became clear that the HIV virus was transmitted via blood. They instituted rigorous testing of plasma for HIV and other potentially infectious diseases. Additionally, strict donor screening procedures were put in place. Plasma centers were now mandated to maintain detailed records, ensuring traceability from donor to recipient. And with the rise of the AIDS epidemic, these regulations were a crucial step in ensuring safety. So Moving into the 1990s and 2000, advancements in technology enabled even more precise testing. In particular, nucleic acid testing, or NAT testing, became the standard. This test could detect viral infections even before the body produced antibodies, which is referred to as the window period, I believe, further reducing risks. So you fast forward to the present day, and the plasma collection industry now is a blend of voluntary and paid donors. The U.S. is, in fact, a global leader in plasma collection. Each collection center is tightly regulated by the federal and state authorities, ensuring both quality and safety of the collected plasma. In fact, it has been like something like 30 years since any transmitted infection from a plasma-derived therapy has been documented. And so the safety measures have helped immensely in this space. So the main organizations involved in regulation are the Food and Drug Administration, which we're going to touch on a lot today, Centers for Disease Control, the Plasma Protein Therapeutics Association, also known as the PPTA, which is an internal or an industry industry watch group, the AABB, which was formerly known as the American Association of Blood Banks. Now it's just referred to as the AABB because now it pulls in cellular therapies and other collections there. The College for American Pathologists, state health departments, and together these organizations collaborate and oversee different facets of the plasma collection process, ensuring that it's carried out safely and ethically in the United States. So, James, maybe you could just discuss the main regulatory agencies that we hit on, their role in plasma collection, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really good summary of, the past 30 to 40 years. And I think, I know we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I think the last 4 to 5 years, we've seen obviously a real evolution in the regulatory landscape. Because we're in the US, let's start with the FDA. Obviously, the main branch of the FDA that we deal with is the Center for Biologics. And they are the organization within the FDA that essentially perform all the maintenance and the monitoring of the plasma collection business, as well as the updates and the evolution of the regulations, as well as the any guidance for industry which they release. Their role really primarily is to ensure the safety of the patient population and the donor population. Different perceptually to perhaps European Medicines Agency, which are still very focused on the finished the patient and the donor, but they're very much more centered around GMP compliance, as opposed to the FDA. Really look at pieces from are we, as a plasma collection industry, are we meeting the interpretation of the Code of Federal Regulations, or the guidance for industries, and all the other associated guidance and regulations that are designed and written to protect the safety of the patient and the donor through the donation process. The FDA especially are very involved and active in terms of the medical evaluation piece of our donors. And I think we're going to touch on that a little bit later, but definitely the FDA is the driving force, a great collaborative government agency with our industry. I was on the PPTA chair for the regulatory committee recently, and the conversations we've had with folks such as Dr. Peter Marks, who's the head of SIVA. He's the gentleman who approved the COVID vaccines, essentially. His willingness to work with the plasma collection industry and provide interpretation on the regulations which keep our donors and our patients safe is really a testament to the philosophy of that agency. So by far and between, really, our licensure, our compliance is all driven by the FDA and our relationship with the FDA. The PPTA, I touched on those. They are also a very visible industry partner, originally set up to provide some consistency and standards within the plasma collection business between the main industry or all industry companies, whether they're a global brand or whether they're a smaller plasma collection industry. It's really evolved now. PPTA is to be a vehicle to promote the collection of plasma, ultimately the collection of plasma, which leads as the starting material for all the plasma-derived therapies that are so important. And I think we're magnified the importance of having the availability of these plasma-derived therapies during the pandemic, where a patient with immunocompromised or hemophilia or any other bloodborne diseases really relied on the plasma collection to ensure the their medicine supply chain is not impacted by the pandemic. Other agencies, you touched on the AABB, is also an important regulator, especially in the immunizing side of the plasma collection side, as well as the blood collection piece. CLIA, which is an arm of the government as well. CLIA is Clinical Lab Improvements Amendments. We have to follow some of those regulations because we have certain tests in the plasma world that are monitored, and they've been given a certain designation under laboratory testing, which provides us to do certain things, have certain medical staff as expertise, and perform periodic checks. They're the main ones that we have to really think about from a US perspective. If you're a plasma collector and you either are a global organization or you supply to a global organization, you probably also have to follow a lot of the European regulations for plasma collection. You may have to follow a lot of the Chinese regulations or any other really countries' regulations that ultimately you provide plasma, where a company then produces the plasma-derived medicines too. So it can get very complicated, as Chris, you and I know, when we've been working together, as how do you balance perhaps conflicting philosophies and compliance priorities with the FDA or the EMA or the CLIA. And that's, I think, part of the complexities of the regulatory landscape of the plasma collection business.
Yeah, they each have the same end goal in mind, right? But they do have conflicting ideologies sometimes, and that can be challenging to navigate. So it requires a lot of discussion and a lot of, compromise, I think, in some situations too, to make sure that you're meeting the different ideologies between the different regulatory agencies. So okay, so that's the regulatory landscape. So now, why are these important?
So let's use the medical piece as an example, right? When a donor is moved through the screening and the eligibility piece, we'll kind of keep it simple at that point. The regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations or in the European directives, which mandate the European plasma and blood collection laws, which, again, companies in the US have to follow if they're providing plasma to Europe. They're very, very specific in terms of what the health of the donor can be in order to be able to donate. If you think about it, as we know, they're providing up to 800 plus ml of their body fluids, potentially twice a week. That can have certain impacts to their system, to their medical health. So how we check the donors in terms of their physiological status before they donate is very important to ensure that those donors are not impacted by the donation process. The flip side of it is, to your point, it's been 3-4 decades since we've had any impacted plasma-derived therapy from a viral perspective. And that's because of the testing, that's because of the assessment of the donor's risk to perhaps contract a viral, an RTTI, the relevant transfusion infection, as the FDA calls it, to ensure that the plasma that we collect from that healthy donor does not contain any components of viral load that will potentially impact the quality of that plasma. They're the two main reasons, but the regulations, which are perhaps not direct to the plasma collection business, but they are closely linked and directly associated with, is the manufacturing piece. And the manufacturing, when the manufacturing companies take their plasma and they run it through a series of very intense manufacturing steps with testing all the way through the process. That's also designed to ensure maximum safety for the patient ultimately when the final product is finished and released for hospitals and clinics. So ultimately, every interpretation of the regulation is there for those two things.
So speaking of the health of the donor, so I don't know if you saw it, but just today they released the results of the study that they've been doing on plasma donation frequency and its impact on the health of the donor. And I know that we saw some of the data presented at last year's PPTA conference in Washington, D.C. And so it's exciting to see that out now. It's a peer-reviewed study. We'll put a link in the show notes for people to review. But so that goes along the lines of kind of what we're talking about here. So
yeah, absolutely. I think just that the importance, just to touch on that, the importance of how the industry collects those adverse events. The accuracy of how they collect those adverse events, how they report them to the agencies, how they report the test results to the state departments, which ultimately report to the CDC. All that data collection is so important because it provides the substantive evidence that plasma collection is safe as it's under the guidance of the regulations. And it also, I think, provides ultimately data. I'm a scientist. I look at data to say this process, whether it is a plasma collection, is safe for the donors. And it really kind of provides, when there are media debates about the safeness of plasma collection, this kind of study really supports our industry in terms of we are validated in terms of how we collect this data, how this data shows it's safe for the donors, and ultimately that provides the raw material and the starting material for the manufacturers. So really important.
So from a donor perspective too, is if I'm a donor and I'm coming in, I'm going to want to know if this is safe, right? And I'm going to want to know if I donate twice a week, am I going to get sick because now you're taking all of these antibodies from me? And I think this study really shows that generally that's not the case. And so it's, like I said, we'll link it in the show notes. It's great material, and like the study has been peer reviewed, and so it was good stuff.
Yeah.
So I want to move into the current state of the plasma collection business in the United States. I want to talk about the growth of the plasma collection industry. First, it is important to note that something like 70+% of the world's supply of plasma comes from the United States. And that has to do with the regulatory framework that's in place that allows for compensation and increased donor frequency versus many other countries. And the reason from a regulatory framework that we've been able to do that is because we put various tests in place to test the donor at certain intervals to make sure that they're not, being depleted of anything that they need to continue to be healthy. It's an industry that has consistently grown 6 to 8% year over year, especially over the last 15 years. And that same trajectory is anticipated to continue for the next, 7 to 10 years. And the reason for this is like increased access to products made from immunoglobulins, primarily by countries experiencing as they climb the economic ladder, right? It's the U.S. is a large driver of usage, but patients don't suffer from an incident rate higher than other countries. It's just the access to these medications. And so as countries continue to gain access, we'll continue to see growth, particularly in the IG market. And then there's continual increased access to diagnosis and then increased new indications. Yeah. It's a growing industry. It's going to continue to grow. And the impact, we've talked about this in other podcasts. Cellular therapies will continue to maybe chip away at some of these diseases, but there's so many. I mean, like as an example, the primary immune deficiency, there's something like 400 plus variants of this. And so how do you derive a cellular therapy that targets all of them? It's virtually impossible. And so we'll continue to see growth there. But for now, the industry is strong and continues to grow, pretty significantly. So in the United States, there are now probably 11 to 1,200 collection centers. So it's versus the 300 or fewer when I started in the industry. So it's seen, which was about 20 years ago, but it's seen tremendous growth. And like the question always comes up is, are we reaching a point of saturation? And I would say not even close. to a point of saturation. Not everybody shares that same opinion, but first, demand continues to surge in this industry. So the demand for source plasma continues to grow. Second, if you think about the plasma donation process in general, donors typically come because there's a financial incentive. And then it's our job to continue to educate the donors as to why this is important and to continue to get them to come in and donate. But if you think about inflation and its impact, on the household budget, whether a donor's there for subsistence or to supplement their income, it just doesn't matter as long as we're, like creating a safe environment for the donor, first do no harm, and then really ensuring the safety of the product for the patient, because in the end, it is about the patients and ensuring they have enough sufficient access to the medication. So aside from the ever increasing cost of donor compensation, the donor experience will be crucial here. At some point, the economics of it become really challenging if compensation increases too much. But things like location, ease of access for the donor, the value of the donor's time, ensuring they get in and out, the aesthetics of the collection center, think like Walmart versus Target, these all play into the donor experience, and we've only tapped a very small portion of potential plasma donors in the United States. So as it becomes more common, and the pandemic really helped with that, right? It helped shed light on the importance of plasma donation and the various applications of this incredible resource. The donors will see additional value, I think, in the experience. Of course, like they're only going to come in sufficient amounts based on the financial incentives that we put in place. But in order to keep the donors wanting to participate in this important healthcare function, it's important that they see additional value in the experience of the community created around plasma donation. James, what do you view as challenges in the industry?
Well, I think the growth you've spoken to, right? I mean, I think all those things are still very valid, and I agree. I think time in the plasma business has shown the upward curve, and that's everything you've just said. It's increased detection. It's a larger U.S. domestic market, and it's tapping into new and emerging markets. A lot of larger plasma collection organizations have got a secure footprint in China, and China has their own processes and they have their own collection centers, but they're still at in kind of toddler level compared to the US in terms of like being able to ramp up and produce plasma. So I think that the growth is forever going to be moving in the next decade or two. Absolutely. I think the challenges from a regulatory perspective is when we think about how do we maintain control is one piece. How do we, if we need more donors, if we need to have more flexible ways of collecting donors and donations, how do we apply the interpretation of the regulations to continue to meet the concerns of the FDA, but also continue to meet our own philosophical standards of how do we collect the donation safety. So I think there are a number of examples there. I think technology is a big piece, and we're going to talk about that next. But I think also, how do we push and how do we engage with the regulators on specific on specific topics? And I think that has historically been the most productive way of having these conversations. How do we create efficiencies within the plasma collection flow? How do we reduce bureaucracy without reducing the oversight and the concurrent documentation and things like that? And I think specific examples, whether it's the notification process, whether it's the total protein impact of the whole process to the organization, we've got to be looking at those things and engaging with the FDA to get their feedback. Because I think what I've learned, at least the last 4 or 5 years, as we've started to they've become much more progressive, not just because of COVID. I think they were already doing that. They're a lot more open to not just technology, but a different way of doing things. If we're able to show that we still have the control, we still have the donors' best interests and safety paramount, and all those changes still meet the requirements of the regulation. So I think it comes down to, without picking specific examples, it's that interaction with the FDA especially, and using the PPTA as a voice of the industry to be able to engage. So I think in this point, the collective industry, historically, organizations have gone their own path and they've had feedback from the FDA. But I really think on a lot of these things, if the industry is able to kind of band together and have a common theme and use the PPTA and use these other organizations to engage with the FDA on whatever that example may be, that's going to be our best way for, as an industry as a whole, to collectively grow and meet the needs of China, of the US the domestic collection, because it's a little different to how we've done things. I think historically, each company has done things very differently and kept things, obviously for business reasons, kept things very tight to their chest. But I think certain things, the collective knowledge and the collective mindset will help the industry as a whole move forward.
Yeah. Do you have a couple of examples here of some of these?
Yeah, I mean, the recent one that I wouldn't say it's a challenge. I think it was a challenge from a political standpoint with the FDA and I think it's a very welcome change. You talked about NAT testing and specifically HIV, which was really the most visible viral marker that we test for in the plasma collection. In recent years, MSM, male sex with male, has always been a deferral. In recent years, the last 4 to 5 years, the FDA, along with using data, have reduced the deferral period. They've loosened the criteria because they've recognized in today's society, the MSM community do not provide any level of threat to the quality and safety of the plasma collection. This last year or two, obviously, a lot of other countries, the UK, Canada, Ireland, many other countries, Australia, have started to adapt their regulatory stance to really catch up with how the world thinks about the different progressive situations. And I think having the FDA in a place where they are open to using their data to making regulatory changes to allow additional donors based on risk to donate is a great example. And I was part last year and earlier this year, part of that collective industry conversation that really worked and partnered with the FDA to provide some real life context on how can we roll this out? How can we make this a regulation, something that the industry has to follow, but how really thinking about the political, the social interactions that we have with donors, how do we do that? So that was I think a really important example where it was a regulatory challenge due to the political landscape changing, and rightfully so. But how do we then partner with the FDA as an industry to make those changes? And I think the HIV guidance is a great example.
Yeah, so with the new questionnaire that has come out, it's more of an individual assessment versus targeting a particular group. So and one group does not, especially with the technology the way it is, specifically the testing and pathogen reduction combined in the manufacturing process, then it makes sense because one group doesn't necessarily present a higher risk than any others, especially if you're doing an individual risk assessment. So.
Yeah, exactly. And the second thing I think as an industry, we've experienced, and I will say pre and post COVID, is there has been a change in how the FDA has interpreted certain regulations. I think they, like all of us, had to stay at our homes, stay in our houses, and that gave us all more time to read regulations, to interpret regulations, to apply those regulations to procedures, whether it's the FDA looking at a company's procedures, whether it's ourselves looking at how we interpret the regulations to our own SOPs, and evolving that thought. And by that, I don't mean becoming more restrictive or less restrictive. I think you can see both sides of the fence. But definitely there's been a shift in the last 2 or 3 years on how the industry and how the FDA has looked at certain issues, or certain regulations that have maybe not been enforced before, which were now being enforced. So I think that has been a challenge. I think, again, it comes down to having that open dialogue with the FDA and them being on the side of, we understand this is a business. We're in the business to collect plasma, but without that business, without that efficiency, we can't provide the plasma to the manufacturers or our customers to make those plasma-derived medicines. And I think for the most part, the FDA appreciate and recognize the flexibility with the collection. It just comes down to, if we interpret a regulation a certain way, whether that is testing every unit, even if a unit is discarded, for example, how do we communicate how we have the risk and the safety, and we have all the associated pieces in place to be able to ensure the safety of that unit or that donor, versus the strict interpretation of the FDA. So it's an ongoing challenge, but I think it's also an ongoing opportunity to increase that back and forth with our regulators.
Yeah, and speaking of the pandemic and perhaps the increased utilization of telehealth and things like that, thinking about how we can pull some of those components in while maintaining the integrity of the system, but also providing a more seamless experience for the donor. Instead of maybe having to spend 3 hours at a donor center on your first visit, maybe some of that time can be cut down on using some of the other things, or on return visits using mobile donor history questionnaires and things like that. So
yeah, absolutely.
All really good components that continue to evolve and continue to be investigated there. So okay, so I want to move into just a little bit of an educational component for our listeners who may not be as familiar with the plasma donation process. So, and this is more strictly speaking to just how things work within the collection center. But as a plasma donor, you come into a center. If it's your first visit, we'll get some information from you. You'll go through a very basic medical history, physical exam. And then you go through a screening process where they check things like your hematocrit, your blood pressure, pulse, temperature, things like that. And then you'll move to the donation process itself, which is a 30 to 45-minute process where you're hooked up to a machine and your blood is pulled out, it's centrifuged, and then your blood cells are returned back to you while the plasma spills over into a bottle. And this is all in a closed, contained system that's disposed after every donation. And then after your donation, you sit there for a few minutes, you go home, and then you can come back as soon as 2 days later. And so when you come back, you come back the next time, and then the whole process maybe takes 90 minutes. And you go through a similar process, but it's not quite as detailed on that next step. It's something you can do up to 104 times a year. We talked about that, and you do get compensated for each time. And the compensation varies depending on where you're at and who you're donating with, et cetera. So, James, we talked about it from a regulatory perspective, but can you talk a little bit more about the importance of donating plasma?
Yeah, absolutely. This is probably the reason why I've been in the industry for nearly 20 years. The first half of my life in plasma derived, I was running the laboratory at a manufacturing facility in Los Angeles, which tested the raw material, which tested the intermediates of the medicine, and tested the final little vial to make sure it was manufactured correctly from a biochemistry standpoint, as well as it was safe. So, a patient without any hesitation could receive that from their clinician or the hospital supply, prep it, inject it straight into themselves, and know that was going to be completely safe. And I think the first half of my life was I had experiences where every year a patient would come and talk to the entire organization, and some really kind of stuck with me. I remember one year was a guy probably late teens, 16, 17, I think he was, and up to the age of 8 years old, he'd explained that he really couldn't move off his couch. He had hemophilia, and when we think of hemophilia, perhaps if you don't know hemophilia, you think, okay, you scratch yourself, you're going to bleed out a little bit too much. But the type of hemophilia that this particular boy suffered from, he had a lot of internal bleeds. So his joints, his knee joints, would internally start to bleed, which caused inflammation, which caused swelling, which caused pain, and ultimately can lead to arthritis. he couldn't really spend much of his kind of younger childhood out in the street playing with his friends for fear of actually getting a knock or there being a bleed that will impact him. So, and at the time, this is 15 years ago, there was no necessarily. It took a while to diagnose what was going on. His story, how his mom explained his story, and then ultimately how he started on a factor VIII product, which was a protein we collect from plasma that manufactures factor VIII, which basically is part of the bleeding process that stops bleeding. Almost overnight after his first treatments, he became a boy in his early teens or preteens that could go play outside again. And to see pictures of him that he'd have on the slideshow, pictures of him on the couch, and imagine all his friends were outside playing in the street, and then ultimately he could go out. It was really kind of things like that stuck with me. The boy in the bubble, which is probably if you Google that, completely same thing. He was a boy that had absolutely a very minimal and ineffective immunosystem, and without the kind of medication that these plasma-derived therapy organizations manufacture from the source plasma, people like this couldn't really have a life, and maybe even have a shortened life. Well, definitely have a shortened life as well. So I think those things have really stuck for me. These particular diseases are relatively rare. If we think about, any other disease, unfortunately, common diseases, the media knows these well, but there's not enough media attention, I think, associated with these types of CIPD, hemophilia, immunocompromised. But the source plasma that the donors collect, every part of that plasma is used to manufacture a different medicine to be able to support those those patients that I've just talked about. So that's really, to me, the importance of why we do it.
Yeah, and for the patient perspective, for our listeners, if you go back to episode 7, I think it is, we do have a patient on here who's great and talks about the patient experience and everything from getting infections to now getting treatments from plasma-derived therapies. And it is a pretty amazing story. And James, you touched on these being rare and chronic conditions. And when we say rare, there's still millions of people throughout the world that are afflicted by these. So rare in terms of 8 billion people, there's still a lot of people that are affected, but you're right, they don't grab the media attention. And one of the most famous movies that you mentioned is The Boy in the Bubble, who had primary immunodeficiency, I think it was. And that was at a time when we were just starting to really learn about these therapies and these conditions. And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Great. So thanks for going through those. I want to maybe talk about some of the common myths surrounding plasma donation, and one has to do with compensation. I often hear from donors that, oh, you guys receive thousands of dollars for these per unit of plasma, but the donor only receives $50. That's not true. While yes, there is a profit margin associated with these, I think the compensation that is given to the donor is a great way to continue to ensure that patients have access to these therapies. But that's one that I often hear, and it's certainly not that high. Another one is that plasma is used to manufacture cosmetics. Have you heard that one before?
I don't think I have, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it is one that I used to hear quite a bit. And no, I think if you think about the products associated with it, it's immunoglobulins, it's albumin, it's the various proteins that go to these different conditions. One of
the most enjoyable pieces that I've had in visiting donation centers is just sitting down on a bed next to someone and asking them, do you know what happens with your plasma? And I still think, as an industry, I think there's a greater opportunity for us to educate them. We don't need to explain, okay, it goes through a filtration system, for them to really understand. When I start to talk to a donor about what happens with that plasma, it goes into a manufacturing facility, it goes through these steps, and ultimately it goes into a patient who has those diseases, if you explain, it really opens their eyes to those donors. It's amazing.
Mhm. The next one is that homeless people can donate. I'll let you touch on that one.
Yeah, and that's part of the kind of control and the notification process. Ultimately, if to keep it relatively simple, if a donor receives a test result that is positive for HIV or hepatitis, for example, it's the regulations that we have to have an address, have to be able to contact them, have to notify them and counsel them so they can go and see a personal care provider. So they understand that they, at some point, have contracted an RTTI disease. So yeah, from a homeless perspective, now there is becoming some flexibility there, but I think it's still, that's the reason from a regulatory perspective that you need to have a place that you're contactable and you are able to be reachable by the organization from the FDA and the PPTA.
Yeah, and I would encourage any of our listeners, if you have certain perceptions about plasma donation, go visit your plasma donation center that's nearby, and you'll maybe see a different experience than what you're perceiving. The industry has come a long way, and these are nice facilities. They have a lot of good components to them. They're not in really bad areas. They're aesthetically pleasing, and some are really nice. I will say that the industry, maybe throughout its history, like there has been this perception of sort of this ick factor associated with plasma donation. But I encourage the listeners, go visit one that's nearby you. Even if you don't donate, just go walk in and see what you experience. And I think that it will change your mind.
Yeah, and I think one thing as well, Chris, is the because of the regulations that require such a thorough medical examination to ensure the safety, to ensure the health of the donor, like you said, whether it's blood pressure, pulse, whether it's protein levels in the body, whether it's the fact that you're not at risk to contracting HIV, all these things are regulated and mandated, which is why we have to do them. But a lot of donors also utilize that information, that medical history information, to ensure that they remain healthy themselves. So it's also, a good way for people to check their blood pressure if they don't have a personal care provider. Yeah. It really, because ultimately the regulations require it. So from a donation standpoint, make use of that.
Yeah. Okay, just some quick tips for a safe and successful donation. Stay hydrated, drink plenty of water before your visit. Don't drink too much water so that you have to go to the bathroom halfway through the process, but stay hydrated. Eat a good meal before donating. Avoid alcohol and caffeine before donating, and you will have a pleasant experience. Okay, some commonly asked questions here. So what are some of the most common questions you hear related to the regulatory side of the business?
Yeah, I think the number one, especially in recent years, is if I'm a male who has sex with another male, why can't I donate? And I think that is definitely in recent years because of the evolution of thought based on the amount of testing we do and the risk assessments. I think before then, the questions that would come is why can't I donate? And it's important as any organization has talking points to that because it is historically based on risk of the plasma being compromised from a quality perspective. Not anymore, but I think that's a big piece. I think the regulatory side of it, we have, as an industry, if we look at our processes, the procedures that the people in the donor centers follow, you can map out pretty much any part of that process to a regulation that's required. And I think some of those things I've historically looked at and said, okay, why are we doing it this way? Why are we doing it this way? And I think because the regulations are very thorough, very complex, we have to be able to map them out in terms of the processes and why the donors have to do a certain thing. It's really, really important. I think that a lot of if donors really don't understand why they have to do that, a lot of it is the regulations. And I think that goes a long way for people to understand why. Well, it's to protect yourself as a donor, and it's to protect the patient that will receive your plasma. So definitely that's a big piece that Could be different examples, so to speak, but definitely hear a lot about that.
Okay. How often are plasma centers in the United States inspected by the Food and Drug Administration?
A new plasma center. So, Chris, if you open a new plasma center, you have to apply to add it to your biologics license, right? You have to add it to your biologics license. What that means is essentially the FDA will come to your facility, come to your donor center, and say, are you following the regulations in this environment with the people who are employed in that facility? That could take up to a year from when you open your facility, and you have to go through the regulatory submission process. After that, generally, you're inspected every 2 to 3 years, sometimes more. Sometimes if there's a situation, a medical situation with the donor, the FDA will show up because you have to report all that stuff. But generally every 2 to 3 years.
Okay. What's the difference between source plasma and recovered plasma?
From a regulatory perspective, there's actually quite a lot in terms of how the agencies that you have to follow, the times that you have to store and freeze plasma, things like that. But essentially, source plasma is essentially plasma that is directly received from the donor, from the blood, which is centrifuged and then canted into a plasma bottle. Recovered plasma comes after the actual blood collection process and then separated into the plasma. And generally, a source plasma is collected in a plasma bottle, and the recovered plasma is covered in a bag, and then it's sent to the final manufacturer. Some of the regulations in terms of collection and testing, as well as how you're supposed to handle and store and freeze the plasma, are different as well.
Yeah, so just for our listeners, so source plasma and recovered plasma are essentially used in the same manufacturing process, but source plasma makes up about over 90% of the total plasma that's manufactured. So recovered plasma typically is provided from a blood provider like the American Red Cross, Vitalant, One Blood. And it makes up somewhere not quite 10% of the entire plasma material. So
yeah.
Okay, so how can we ensure that a medication a patient is receiving from a plasma-derived therapy is safe?
So I think we've touched on quite a few of the process steps, the critical control points, right? We think about, again, everything I'm going to explain comes from a regulation, whether it's an FDA regulation or a European regulation. The fact that you've had a patient on, and I've talked with patients that in their mind, the last thing is this medication safe? The same way we would take an aspirin, or we would take some cough medicine and not even think, is this going to be safe? Is this going to make me sicker? Right. Is this infected? Is this been produced in a sterile manner? And that comes down to the patients generally in our industry are certainly very knowledgeable in the manufacturing process. And that comes from all the testing we do, all the screening of the plasma in the plasma collection business to make sure that it is safe, it meets certain parameters, testing parameters, biochemistry parameters. And when it moves into the manufacturing, same thing. Throughout the whole process, we follow in the regulations and the procedures to make sure that the plasma is, as it becomes the medicine, as it becomes the little vial that you see on your hospital shelf, all those steps are controlled, have been verified. And ultimately, that gives the patient an unwavering confidence that I'm just taking my vial, I'm going to rehydrate it, and I'm going to inject it into myself, or I'm going to have it infused into myself. And that's the biggest thing that's always amazed me, considering that it's one of the very few medicines that we use human raw material as the starting material. You know, you think about aspirin, you think about cough medicine, they all come from chemically synthesized products that are still very importantly manufactured. But the fact that our product comes from the plasma, the human plasma that we collect as a raw material, And it goes through this such a rigorous manufacturing process and controls and filtrations and things like that. Really gives that patient that unwavering confidence that this plasma-derived therapy that I'm about to infuse or inject is completely safe and will make me better, not worse.
Yeah, yeah. Well, James, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion thinking about how a unit of plasma goes from a unit of plasma to a medication and how that creates a safe environment for both the donor and for the patients. And it really has to do with both industry and the regulators working together to figure out the safest way to make this happen and ensuring that there's oversight within the industry. Again, thanks. I really appreciate your time today.
You're welcome, Chris. No, I think a final snippet, again, maybe I'm a little skewed in this, but I think when we think about the plasma-derived therapy, either the collection piece or the manufacturing piece, all roads lead to the regulations, and the regulations have been written and evolved over 3-4 decades to do two things: to protect the donor and to ensure that the patient receives a safe medicine. And I think as an industry, again, I'm a little skewed, but if that's where we start in our thinking, whether we can be more technologically advanced, whether we can be more efficient, I think then the industry will continue to gain momentum, and certainly that will give the donor and the patient the best experience. So yeah, I've enjoyed chatting with you and catching up with you.
All right. And for our listeners, please go donate plasma, visit a plasma center near you. If you're wondering where they're located, please visit our website and you'll see, you can type in your zip code and you will see all of the plasma centers located around you, not just the Proasis brand. Again, thank you for your time and donate plasma today. So thanks, James. It's great talking to you.
You're welcome. Cheers, man. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, and remember, plasma saves lives. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share with your friends and fellow plasma donors. I'd love to connect with you. If you are interested in discussing today's episode further, please send a message to info@proasisbio.com. That's info@proasisbio.com. And don't forget to follow us on social media for up-to-date information. Find us by searching @ProasisBio. Talk soon.